The planet is a treacherous place. Despite humanity calling this ball of rock and mud home, and despite all of our advancements over the millennia, the reality is, outside of the use of our modern day technology like GPS, central heating and cooling, fresh water to drink, and readily available food sources, there isn't much separating us from the food chain that in a lot of ways still very much so exists just outside of our established townships. If something were to kick off where most of our tech was rendered useless in today's atmosphere, I have no doubt that our population would plummet hard as we would be forced to return back to the old ways of doing things just for pure survival. Hunting the land for food, tilling the ground ourselves to grow the food, attempting to survive against the elements our planet not so much throws at us, but just by its existence and its natural cycles and the addition and subtraction of energy from the sun, our species really just has to hold on and wait for it to pass. The point is, life outside of modern day is very cruel, uncaring, and at some point, it may even appear to just be taking us out on purpose. Yet, even with all this, humanity, since the days of us attacking mammoths with spears and axes, to the discovery of gunpowder with the subsequent handhelds being used, to lighting a fire under a rocket saying, "I'm sure this thing won't blow up, but we better stand pretty far back just in case," the reality is we've thrived. But even with us thriving and doing pretty well, there is an interesting period of time that we can point to that was sort of a blending of the current time frame where, sure, mystery still exists today and in today's era, but things are more explainable. And this combines with the time frame of the past where things were a little more muddied. Around the 1760s, a new event was taking place during the Age of Enlightenment. It seemed out of nowhere that our species was finding new ways to automate and make life easier. It started simply enough when Thomas Newcomen designed a prototype for the first modern steam engine called the atmospheric steam engine. This engine would kick off a plethora of other advancements that would then lead to other inventions built upon the ideas that ultimately would culminate into where we are now, sort of like standing on the shoulders of giants. So don't get me wrong, we're still very much so industrializing, but we have moved outside of the range of just industry, past the nuclear age, and into not spacefaring, but space exploring age. In fact, it is said that humans have entered the later stages of a Type 1 civilization, meaning we harness the energy of our planet, and into a very primitive Type 2 civilization, which we will begin to start accessing the energy of our star more reliably. So things like solar panels, for instance. Granted, we will look at these in the future as nothing more than like the steam engine of our time, a relic from the past that's neither here nor there though. Moving back to the industrial age. In the 1700s and 1800s, these were eras that were marred and enriched by inventions. In some ways, this era mirrors our current status, but in others, it still very much so showed its roots in our primitive past. People working 16-hour days, younglings working in these factories as well, dangerous machinery with exposed parts, horrific events that caused the ending of people, pollution, all that good stuff that we had to travel through to get to where we are now, which is better, but it still kind of has a ways to go. And during this period of time, one other thing that remained consistent and still has remained continuous to this day is the innate curiosity of mankind that needed to be satiated. See, time is a flat circle, if you will. We do the same things over and over again, but what really changes is the scenery. So look me in the eyes and tell me that if we get to Mars, if we, don't blow each other up before then, we won't just put a bunch of buildings on it. Oh, that asteroid we were mining? Well, much like mining on Earth, we need to blow it up to get the resources out of it. Oh, what's that, Ooga? You say you need more firewood for the fire and you have a better route around the saber-toothed den? Well, let's go near the short-faced bear den and then get it. Well, Ooga's gone, so that sucks, but oh, there's a black hole out there. But on the other side is a trading planet. Well, we need to find a way to get around it, which requires us going close to it without getting sucked in. And wait a minute, okay, that ship got torn apart, so we need to find another way around it. The point of these ramblings is it doesn't matter the technology scale. It doesn't matter how carefully you plan. Nature will always screw with humanity in some form or fashion, which becomes something to be heeded down the road. A warning for future humans in this specific instance that will later be given to us again, just in a completely different way, but the substance of the warning will remain the same, which is exactly why I will not be boarding those commercial planes that go to the edge of space, because just because the first one did well does not mean one's gonna just have doesn't mean one's gonna just not have a catastrophic failure, and then we'll learn something from it. With new tech, something always has to fail to warn you how to build it better. So just keep that in mind. But enter Franklin's Lost Expedition. I know we got way out there on this one. It's like the ramblings of a madman, or writings of a madman at least. I've had 4 cups of coffee. I was out till 1 a.m. last night with the wife, and I'm ready to write and talk about the blending of an era where, man, Even prepared for what seems to be the worst they could face in an effort to find the Northwest Passage, they would become painfully aware it can always get worse, and our planet would once again test the human spirit of exploration to disastrous results. See, prior to the Industrial Revolution, humanity had been engaged in traversing the oceans for quite some time, while treacherous and with many ships that have been lost along the way, and basically I think we all know at this point the ocean is just a giant graveyard. The reality of trade is it's just so much easier to move a ton of cargo over the waters using wind power than it is to load it up in the caravans and then move it across land. As the trade routes between Europe and Asia became more established, eventually a rival to the Silk Road would be sought after, and this concept was to employ the use of the vast ocean that bordered Europe to the west. As many expeditions set out, one famous one that I think most of us know of is Christopher Columbus, who ended up actually landing in the Caribbean, if I remember correctly, and not mainland North America. But the reason Native Americans were called Indians is because he assumed that he had landed in India at the time and found his way around the planet using the Atlantic Ocean. Because some people thought that it just fell off. Most people knew the Earth was actually a globe at this point, believe it or not, but he had to go prove it. Anyways, this was obviously not the case. He did not land in India, and instead he had landed on a massive new section of land not previously known about to the Europeans, kind of. And there's evidence to support that Vikings had probably already landed there. And clearly the continent was not uninhabited by any metric because people were already there. It was just, again, new to Europeans. Anyhow, something else became apparent that was not exactly ideal for anyone trying to trade with Asia by going west. This newly discovered landmass was sort of in the way, and hilariously, it runs almost the length of the planet north to south. Again, the planet just loves messing with humanity. To the south, dangerous waters near the Antarctic would swirl and rise, swallowing ships, and to the north, nobody actually knew what was out there. Something to remember is that the reason the Panama Canal even exists and was created is because you either have to go like super far north or super far south. Both of those areas are not exactly ideal for transporting cargo. But this is the 1800s, and this canal would not exist for quite some time. As it became more and more clear that this landmass was exceedingly difficult to get around and really didn't save any more time than just sailing around Africa, a passage would be theorized in hopes of them actually finding it as well. Already mentioned, but the Northwest Passage was considered to be possible, which essentially ran through the Arctic Ocean and entered through like the Atlantic Ocean side, and then you could navigate it through to the Pacific Ocean and over to Asia to trade. As we know today, this path does actually exist, but we also know it is extensive and fraught with danger, and depending on when you leave to navigate it, there's a good chance that you will choose incorrectly and aren't coming back, mainly because even with modern models of like polar vortices and how the weather acts out there, things can still just like pop up at random, it almost seems. It just really depends. But this would ultimately result in the Franklin's Lost Expedition. They would be tasked with setting out and discovering this passageway for the English crown and government to help them establish an easier route to trade with Asia. It would result in a tragedy as the entire expedition would be lost to the elements, but how it happened would yield almost as much, if not more information than if it had been successful. So in some respects, it was actually a successful expedition. So in today's episode, let's talk about what became of the sailors and the ultimate outcome of this fated exploration to the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic. But before we start, I want to say I really do appreciate you guys watching. The channel, honestly, has been really a fun creative outlet as of late because I feel like I've been put into a little bit of a box on the main channel. So being able to creatively write here and tell a story has been very cathartic. With y'all supporting the channel, it's been amazing to see it grow. And I want to say thank you for that. For all the salty people that have been on the channel lately, why are you here? But thank you for interacting with the video and getting it out there. Show me your video. Anyways, all right, let's get back to it. As you may have already gathered, the Franklin Expedition, or Franklin's Lost Expedition, was a failed British voyage and was just one of many. However, this one ended so spectacularly bad that it would put a halt for many years on the attempting to find the Northwest Passage. Around the mid-19th century, many explorations would take place, typically originating from England itself in an attempt to add to the knowledge of the geographical conditions of this planet and what exactly the Western Hemisphere held within. Basically, to this point, home base was built and self-sustaining, so it was time to explore. As the knowledge of the Western Hemisphere grew and the aforementioned massive landmass that would house one of the best countries on this rock, United States, and again, maybe I'm just a little biased, was seen as, yep, that's definitely in the way. Naturally, the thinking began, well, we should move further north and see if there's like a way around this landmass. That would gradually shift exploratory expeditions towards the Arctic. And if you don't know about the Arctic, It's incredibly hostile and a dangerous area for life, especially for humans. 16th and 17th century voyagers who made geographical discoveries about North America included Martin Frobisher, John Davis, Henry Hudson, and William Baffin. In 1670, the incorporation of the Hudson Bay Company led to further exploration of the Canadian coastlines, interior, and adjacent Arctic areas, and we'll hear more about them in a little bit. But in the 18th century, explorers of this region included James Knight, Christopher Middleton, Samuel Hearne, James Cook, Alexander Mackenzie, and George Vancouver. By 1800, their discoveries had conclusively demonstrated that no Northwest Passage between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans actually existed in temperate latitudes, which means you gotta go somewhere worse to find it. In 1804, Sir John Barrow became second Secretary of the Admiralty, a post he held until 1845. Barrow began pushing for the Royal Navy to find a Northwest Passage over the top of Canada and to navigate towards the North Pole, organizing a major series of expeditions. Over those 4 decades, explorers including John Ross, David Buchan, William Edward Perry, Frederick William Beechey, James Clark Ross, which is the nephew of John Ross, George Back, Peter Warren Dease, and Thomas Simpson led productive expeditions to the Canadian Arctic. Among those explorers was John Franklin, who first traveled to the region in 1818 as second in command of an expedition towards the North Pole in the ships Dorothea and Trent. Franklin was subsequently leader of the 2 overland expeditions to and along the Canadian Arctic coast in 1819 to 22 and 1825 to 27. By 1845, the combined discoveries of all these expeditions had reduced the unknown parts of the Canadian Arctic that might contain the Northwest Passage to a quadrilateral area of about 181,300 kilometers squared, which is about 70,000 square miles. It was into this unexplored area that the next expedition was to sail, heading through the Lancaster Sound, then west and south, with the goal of finding a Northwest Passage. The distance to be navigated was roughly about 1,670 kilometers, or about 1,040 miles. With this knowledge in hand, this group effort, over the course of a few hundred years previously, and then decades subsequently, like recently at least, this would make the actual preparations that could be made in order to discover this way around the landmass. The time it took, however, would ensure that Barrow had reached the ripe old age of 82 years old and was getting to the point where he figured it was probably time to retire. If I'm working at 82, I better love my job more than I love sleep, because good lord, this guy was essentially a giga chad for sticking around that long and being that committed to his job. But there's an old saying, give a man a purpose and he will be young again. Barrow wasn't just sitting around waiting to take his last breath like a lot of 82-year-olds were at this time. He felt he was right on the cusp of finding this passage, which likely pushed him to even be sticking around this long in the first place. Victory hanged in the balance sort of deal. Barrow believed that somewhere in the Arctic, an ice-free passage existed around the North Pole and around this landmass, and because of this, he would organize his fated expedition to find it. He initially had quite a few choices on who was going to lead this expedition. His first choice would be a man named Perry, who just straight up declined as he had grown weary of the Arctic, which, I mean, that's actually not that strange of a thing. Can't blame him for there. His second choice was a man named James Clark Ross, who also was like, nope, I'm good, because he used to be an adventurer like you, but took an arrow to the knee and promised his new wife that he was done with polar exploration. Bro, snows before wives. Because of his simping for a loving wife and family, Barrow would then turn to his third choice, James Fitzjames. Man, what a name. But the Admiralty Board rejected him because he was too young. His fourth choice, Francis Crozier, was also another possibility, but apparently literally was not cool enough because of his humble birth, and he was Irish, which apparently counted against him. Okay. So I break into this because I just realized something. I don't know if you guys really know this, because I think a lot of people are finding the channel organically, but I actually have like a video game channel where I talk about the biology of actual like monsters and creatures, and I play a lot of Dead Space. But in Dead Space 3, the scaff ships that were lost around Tau Volantis are named like Roanoke, amongst a few others, and they take the Crozier to Tau Volantis. Well, bad choice of names, I guess, if you're just gonna be going out in space and exploring a really cold planet. Anyways, back to the actual reason we were here. Barrow's last choice, like being picked after everyone in Dodgeball sort of deal, was a man named Franklin, who was 59 years old at the time, and I'm sure he felt great about that. The expedition itself would set off with 2 ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, and with a name like that, why not just go with the HMS Unsinkable too? The thing about these ships was that they also had already kind of proven their mettle, and they had been used in previous expeditions to the Antarctic in 1841 through 1844. The Erebus was 378 tons, and the Terror was 331 tons, and they were sturdily built and well equipped, including several recent inventions. Steam engines were fitted, driving a single screw propeller in each vessel. These engines were converted former locomotives from the London and Croydon Railway. These ships could make around 7.4 kilometers per hour or 4 nautical miles per hour on steam power and travel under wind power to reach higher speeds and save fuel. Other advanced technology in the ships included reinforced bows constructed of heavy beams and iron plates, an internal steam heating system for the comfort of the crew in polar conditions, and a system of iron wells that allowed the screw propellers and iron rudders to be withdrawn into the hull to protect them from damage. The ships also carried libraries of more than 1,000 books and 3-year supply of food, which included tinned soup and vegetables, salt-cured meat, pemmican, and several live cattle. The tinned food was supplied from a provisioner, Stephen Goldner, who was awarded the contract on April 1st, 1845, a mere 7 weeks before Franklin set sail. Goldner worked frantically on the large order of 8,000 tins. Unfortunately, a problem would begin to arise as the haste required affected quality control of some of the tins, which were later found to have lead soldering that was thick and sloppily done and dripped like melted candle wax down the inside surface. Most of the crew were English, many from northern England, with smaller numbers of Irish, Welsh, and Scottish members. 2 of the sailors were not born in the British Isles, Charles Johnson, who was from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, and Henry Lloyd, who's from Kristiansand, Norway. The only officers with prior experience in the Arctic were Franklin, Crozier, Erebus First Lieutenant Graham Gore, Terror Assistant Surgeon Alexander MacDonald, and 2 ice masters, James Reed, who was on the Erebus, and Thomas Blankley. After those advancements were made to the ship, the authority was chosen based on previous experience. Crozier had actually commanded the Terror prior, so he was given it once more, and Franklin was given command of the Erebus. Franklin has officially received command of the expedition as of February 7th, 1845, and received his instructions on May 5th, 1845. With the stage set for the expedition, it would officially set sail one day after my birthday, 147 years previous. In layman's term, that would be May 19th, 1845. They would set off on this journey from Greenhithe, Kent, with a crew of 24 officers and 110 men to work the ships. As they sailed away, they would stop briefly over in Stromness, the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland, and at the conclusion of this stop, they would then set sail to Greenland with the HMS Rattler and another transport ship, Barretto Jr. The sailing to Greenland would take about 30 days. Upon reaching Greenland, they would then stop at the Whalefish Islands in Disco Bay on the west coast of Greenland. The oxen that were aboard the Barretto Jr. at this point were slaughtered for fresh meat and then moved over to the Erebus and Terror, and from here, crew members were then said to write their families, which was fairly customary at the time, although not a single one of them thought this would be their last communication with their loved ones. Oh, and around this time, Franklin banned swearing and drunkenness on the ships, so Friday nights were about to be pretty lit. This was to be the area before a concerted push to the Northwest Passage began, and as such, many men who had gotten sick around this time might have felt unlucky for not being allowed to stay, but really it saved their lives. 5 men would be discharged and sent home on the Rattler and Barretto Jr., which put the total number of men never to return again at 129. From here, information on the actual ship's locations and what they were doing starts to become a little more sporadic, given the nature of the vastness of the ocean. That said, some ships did come into contact with the Erebus and Terror in July of 1845. Whalers of the Prince of Wales and Enterprise would run into the ships, not literally but figuratively. They were waiting in the Baffin Bay as the weather was still not tremendously great, and they needed to cross the Lancaster Sound. This would be the last time the expedition would be seen or heard from by Europeans. The phrase, "dead men tell no tales," has never been more relevant than this, because over the next 150 years, information would have to be pieced together through subsequent explorations and attempts to find what had happened to the fated Franklin expedition. The only first-hand information we actually have of the expedition's progress is the 2-part note from Victory Point that was found after the expedition had failed, which was located on King William Island. See, something to remember is that expeditions do take a long time. Again, look at the Antarctic expedition that took over 3 years to complete. People would be gone for these long stretches of time, so it was nothing really of a huge concern if you didn't hear from them for a while. This note would be found over 11 years later in May of 1859 by William Hobson. He had located it because it was placed on a cairn on the northwestern coast of King William Island. This note would consist of 2 parts written on a pre-printed Admiralty note that would shed some light on what happened. All bad. The first part of the note that would be written after the first overwintering of 1847, and the second part would be added 1 year later, indicating that they had stayed there for over a year. Now, these islands aren't exactly a paradise, and food would have likely have to be rationed to ensure for, survival. And this clearly didn't happen, but there were some other severe issues going on, but we'll kind of get into that in here in a minute. Franklin's men had actually spent the winter of 1845 to 46 on Beechey Island. Around this time, it is known that 3 crew members just straight up met their end and had to be buried there. Now, likely this could come down to a multitude of things. Infections were quite prevalent during this time frame. It's not really believed that food had become scarce during their stay on the island, but conditions would have likely still been harsh, and the chaos of living could have gotten to them. They would then be buried there, and around the summer, the expedition would then take off once again and travel down the Peel Sound through this time. Eventually, though, both ships would become trapped in ice off of King William Island by September of 1846. The ships were thought around this time to have never freed themselves from the ice, and as a result of that, clearly never sailed again. It's actually quoted as the HMS ships Erebus and Terror wintered the ice after having ascended Wellington Channel at latitude 77 degrees and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well. Party consisting of 2 officers and 6 men left the ships on Monday 24th May of 1847. The second part of the note would go on to show a much more dire situation began to form. This one was dated April 25th, 1848, and signed by both Fitzjames and Crozier. 25th of April, 1848, HMS ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, 5 leagues north-northwest of this, having been beset since the 12th of September 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls under the command of Captain F.M.R. Crozier, landed here. The paper was then found by Lieutenant Irving under the cairn supposed to have been built by Sir James Ross in 1831, 4 miles to the northward, where it had been deposited by late Commander Gore in June of 1847. Sir James Ross' pillar has not, however, been found, and the paper has been transferred to this position, which is that in which Sir J. Ross Pillars was erected. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. Signed James Fitzgerald, Captain HMS Erebus. Signed F.R.M. Crozier, Captain and Senior Officer. And start on tomorrow, the 26th, for Back's Fish River. As stated, it would paint the picture that the crew had wintered off King William Island between 1846 and 1847, and then through 1848. Franklin had met his end on June 11th, 1847. The rest of the crew realized this was not going to work out and abandoned the ships, and had planned to walk over to the island and then over to the sea ice towards Back River on the Canadian mainland around April 26th, 1848. Things at this point had already taken a turn for the worse, it seems. 15 men and 8 officers had also danced with the devil. This Victory Point note is the last little bit of communication left behind by the expedition. From what would be found later over the course of the next 150 years, it's clear some men did make it. About 30 or 40 of the men reached the northern coast of the mainland as they tried to reach Back River, which would mean their trek would be over 250 miles or roughly 400 kilometers of straight-up wilderness. This means that when the last person met their end, they were still hundreds of miles away from the nearest outpost of Western civilization. But, there were probably other civilizations out there. I don't know. I would probably go towards those civilizations. But anyways, in 1859, Hobson found a second document using the same Admiralty form containing an almost identical duplicate of the first message from 1847 in a cairn a few miles southwest of Gore Point. This document did not contain the second message. From the handwriting, it is assumed that all messages were written by Commander James Fitzjames, as he did not take part in the landing party that deposited the notes originally in 1847. It is inferred that both documents were originally filled in by Fitzjames on board the ships, with Lieutenant Graham Gore and mate Charles Frederick Devoe, which I'm pretty sure I said Frederick earlier. I'm going to get roasted in the comments, but hey, what else is new? Adding their signatures as members of the landing party. This is further supported by the fact that both documents contain the same factual errors, namely the wrong date of the wintering on Beechey Island. In 1848, after the abandonment of the ships and subsequent recovery of the document from the Victory Point cairn, Fitzjames added the second message signed by him and Crozier and deposited the note in the cairn found by Hobson 11 years later. As time continued to pass and the families would get no more information as to what happened to their sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands, clearly concern would begin to start building up. At the urging of Jane, Franklin's wife, along with members of the Parliament and British newspapers, the Admiralty Board would send out a search party in order to find the expedition, but they felt there was really no reason to be alarmed. Big thonk there. They would, however, still react because enough people were concerned, and they launched a three-pronged plan. In spring of 1848, they would send an overland rescue party led by John Richardson and John Rae down the Mackenzie River to the Canadian Arctic coast. The other two prongs of the search were launched by sea. One was led by James Clark Ross entering the Canadian Arctic archipelago through the Lancaster Sound, which, by the way, Lancaster is an excellent wine. I just need to tell you that. And the other would be spearheaded by Henry Kellett, who would enter via the Pacific. By this point, things were getting rather spicy, as well as fear began to continuously rise for the fates of the sailors, so a reward would be offered up to £20,000. Now you're thinking to yourself, well, that's not that much, but as of 2023, that is £2,136,300, or in non-monopoly money, that is $2,571,034. And good Lord, that is life-changing money. This would be offered to any person, party, or country that rendered assistance to the crews of the Discovery ships under the command of Sir John Franklin. But with the effort launched, it would be met with silence. Despite it being a pretty good plan, they would come back empty-handed to everyone's dismay. This would have the unintended consequence of sparking British national concern and interest in the Arctic until locating Franklin was said to be nothing short of a crusade, which arguably, I'm sure other people went missing trying to search those waters for Franklin, but they weren't important, so nobody cared. Then around this time, art would also crop up, such as a ballad being written known as the Lady Franklin's Lament. Over the course of the next few years, many ships would jump into the fray in an attempt to locate Franklin's lost expedition, but apart from a camp being found in 1850 that showed they had been in the area for the winter of 1845 to 1846, nothing much would really be found except for graves that started to be located, which did not bode well. But even at the grave site, there was like nobody found. At one point, some ships were found abandoned, but they were not investigated, oddly enough. I mean, they turned out to be whaling ships, but I think for like $2.5 million, I would have at least checked it out for 10 minutes to make sure. Maybe that's just me. Years would pass with no progress being really made to locate these ships. I mean, people were trying to find them, but again, nothing was being found. In fact, a captain named Belcher was court-martialed over getting 4 out of his 5 ships under his command stuck in ice, but then was acquitted later, seeing as it was the Arctic. Things happen. But this would highlight a possible scenario that befell Franklin and his expedition. Then, in 1854, a grisly discovery would be made that would indicate how desperate these men had become. Rae was surveying the Boothia Peninsula for the Hudson Bay Company and would discover what potentially became of these men. Rae met with an Inuk near Pelly Bay on April 21st, 1854, who had told him that a party of around 30 to 40 white men had met their end due to starvation near the mouth of Back River. The other Inuit confirmed the story, which concluded that cannibalism had become rampant amongst the men towards the end. Reports had continued to come in that not just cannibalism had taken place, but the men would have become so desperate that they actually found broken bones at the site. They had eaten the flesh of their compatriots and then went back to crack the bones in order to get the marrow out of said bones. This is known as end-stage cannibalism, and if you are kind of done eating human meat, this is like a last-ditch effort to survive, and this part is much more personal. Eating the fatty marrow and having to break bones of men that you once talked to, I mean, this would have been like your friend. So it's a much more mental experience than a physical one. A new analysis of the 35 bones collected by anthropologists Simon Mays and Owen Betty suggests that cannibalism acts are confirmed and that the bones did show signs of breaking and heating, thus a bone broth would have been made from the men. The evidence that these men had expired there and eaten one another was confirmed as Rae bought several silver forks and spoons later from the Inuits that belonged to Franklin, Fitzjames, Crozier, Fairholme, and Robert Orme Sargent, who was a shipmate aboard the Erebus. This report would be immediately sent to the Admiralty Board in October of 1854, as the HBC would then request an expedition. Oh God, not another expedition! And they would go down the river to search for signs of Franklin and his men. Okay, so here's the thing. So this dude found the expedition. Did he end up getting the money? From what I can find, no, he did not. A man would then be dispatched by the name of Chief Factor James Anderson and HBC employee James Stewart, who then head out traveling north by canoe to the mouth of Back River. In July of 1855, a band of Inuit would then tell them that a bunch of white men had starved along the coast, and that's where they would find them. In August, a piece of wood would be found, and it would have the word Erebus inscribed on it, and another said Mr. Stanley, who was a surgeon aboard the Erebus. And oddly enough, even though this stuff was being found, which would indicate the men would be in the area, the Admiralty Board would not plan another search for the men on their own. Britain officially would go on to regard the crew as lost and deceased in service on March 31st, 1854. Lady Franklin would obviously protest this, but would fail to inspire another search for the expedition. She would, on her own, personally fund the expedition to continue looking, as Francis Leopold McClintock would then take on the expedition to look for them. The schooner Fox would be bought by public subscription and sailed from Aberdeen on July 2nd, 1857. In April of 1859, sled parties sent out from Fox to search on King William Island would be dispatched, and on May 5th, the party led by Lieutenant William Hobson found a document in the cairn left by Crozier and Fitzjames. It contained two messages. The first, dated May 28, 1847, said the Erebus and Terror had wintered in the ice off the northwest coast of King William Island and had wintered earlier at Beechey Island after circumnavigating Cornwallis Island. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well, the message would state. The second message, written in the margins of the same sheet of paper, was much more ominous. Dated April 25, 1848, it reported that the Erebus and Terror had been trapped in ice for a year and a half, and that the crew had abandoned the ships on the 22nd of April. 24 officers and crew had already died, including Franklin, again on June 11, 1847, just 2 weeks after the date of the first note. Crozier was commanding the expedition, and the 105 survivors planned to start out the next day, heading south towards the Back River. This note contains significant errors, most notably the date of the expedition's winter camp at Beechey Island is incorrectly given as 1846 to 1847 rather than 1845 to 1846. The McClintock expedition also found a human skeleton on the southernmost coast of King William Island. Still clothed, it was searched, and some papers were found, including a seaman's certificate for Chief Petty Officer Harry Pegler, captain of the foretop HMS Terror. However, since the uniform was of the ship's steward, it was most likely the body of that of Thomas Armitage, a gunroom steward on Terror and a shipmate of Pegler, whose papers he carried. At another site on the western extreme of the island, Hobson discovered a lifeboat containing 2 skeletons and relics from the Franklin expedition. In the boat was a large amount of abandoned equipment, including boots, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, sponges, slippers, hair combs, and many books, among them a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith. McClintock also took testimony from the Inuit about the expedition's disastrous end. 2 expeditions between 1860 and 1869 by Charles Francis Hall, who lived among the Inuit near Frobisher Bay on Baffin Island and later at Repulse Bay on the Canadian mainland, found camps, graves, relics, all of this on the southern coast of King William Island, but he believed none of the Franklin expedition survivors would be found among the Inuit. In 1869, local Inuit took Hall to a shallow grave on King William Island containing well-preserved skeletal remains and fragments of clothing. These remains were taken to England and interred beneath the Franklin Memorial at Greenwich Old Royal Navy College in London. The eminent biologist Thomas Henry Huxley examined the remains, and it was concluded that they had belonged to Henry Thomas Dundas Le Viscount, second lieutenant of the Erebus. An examination in 2009 suggested that these were actually the remains of Harry Goodsir, assistant surgeon on the Erebus. Although Hall concluded that all of the Franklin crew were dead, he believed that the official expedition records would be found under the stone cairn. With the assistance of his Inuit guides, Hall gathered hundreds of pages of Inuit testimony. Among these materials are accounts of visits to the Franklin ships and an encounter with a party of white men on the southern coast of King William Island near Washington Bay. In the 1990s, this testimony was extensively researched by David C. Woodman and was the basis of 2 books, Unraveling the Franklin Mystery in 1992 and Strangers Among Us in 1995, in which he reconstructs the final months of the expedition. Woodman's narrative challenged existing theories that the expedition's survivors all perished over the remainder of 1848 as they marched south from Victory Point, arguing instead that the Inuit accounts point strongly to most of the 105 survivors cited by Crozier in the final note actually surviving past 1848, remanning at least one of the ships and managing to sail it down along the coast of King William's Island before it sank, with some of the crew members surviving as late as 1851. The hope of finding the other additional expedition records led by Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka of the U.S. Army to organize an expedition to the island between 1878 and 1880. Traveling to the Hudson Bay, assembling a team that included Inuit who had assisted Hall, continued north by foot and dog sled, interviewing Inuit, visiting known and likely sites of the Franklin expedition remains, and wintering on King William Island. Although Schwatka failed to find the hoped-for papers, in a speech at a dinner given in his honor by the American Geographical Society in 1880, he said that the expedition had made the longest sledge journey ever made, both in regard to time and distance, of 11 months and 4 days, and 4,360 kilometers, or 2,710 miles, and that it was the first Arctic expedition of which the whites relied entirely on the same diet as the Inuit, and that it established the loss of the Franklin records beyond all reasonable doubt. However, Schwatka was successful in locating the remains of one of Franklin's men, identified by personal effects as John Irving, 3rd Lieutenant aboard the Terror. Schwatka and Irving's remains returned to Scotland, where they were buried in full honors at Dean Cemetery in Edinburgh on January 7, 1881. The Schwatka expedition found no remnants of the Franklin expedition south of a place known as the Starvation Cove on Adelaide Peninsula. This was about 40 miles or 60 kilometers north of the Crozier's stated goal, the Back River, and several hundred miles away from the nearest western outpost on the Great Slave Lake. Woodman wrote that the Inuit reports that between 1852 and 1858, Crozier and one other expedition member were seen in the Baker Lake area around 400 kilometers or 250 miles to the south, where in 1948, Farley Mowat found a very ancient cairn, not of normal Eskimo construction, inside which were shreds of hardwood box with dovetailed joints. As time continued to pass, we would eventually enter a more modern age that we are in now, and with that, new abilities to attempt to figure out exactly what had happened began to come about. And with that, really, it just becomes more horrible because the fates began to be uncovered more clearly. In June of 1981, Owen Beatty, a professor of anthropology at the University of Alberta, began the 1845 to 1848 Franklin Expedition Forensic Anthropology Project, or FEFAP, when he and his team of researchers and field assistants traveled from Edmonton to King William Island, traversing the island's western coast as Franklin's men did 132 years before. FEFAP hoped to find artifacts and skeletal remains in order to use modern forensics to establish identities and causes of death amongst the lost 129. Although the trek found archaeological artifacts related to 19th century Europeans and undisturbed, disarticulated human remains, Beatty was disappointed that more remains were not found. Examining the bones of Franklin's crewmen, he noted areas of pitting and scaling often found in cases of vitamin C deficiency that can cause scurvy. After returning to Edmonton, he compared notes from a survey with James Savall, an Arctic archaeologist, and noticed skeletal patterns suggesting cannibalism. Seeking information about the Franklin crew's health and diet, he sent bone samples to the Alberta Soil and Feed Testing Laboratory for trace element analysis and assembled another team to visit King William Island. The analysis would find an unexpected level of 226 parts per million of lead in the crewmen's bones, which was 10 times higher than the control samples taken from the Inuit skeletons from the same geographical area. They had about 26 to 36 parts per million. In June of 1982, a team made up of Beatty and 3 students, Walt Kowal, a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Alberta, Arne Carlson, an archaeology and geography student from the Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and Arsene Tunglik, an Inuk student and field assistant, was flown to the west coast of King William Island, where they retraced some of the steps of McClintock in 1859 and Schwatka in 1878 through 79. Discoveries during this expedition included the remains of between 6 to 14 men in the vicinity of McClintock's boat place and artifacts including a complete boot sole fitted with makeshift cleats for better traction. After returning from Edmonton in 1982 and learning of the lead level finding from 1981 expedition, Beatty struggled to find a cause. Possibilities included the lead solder used to seal the expedition's food tins, other food containers lined with lead foil, food coloring, tobacco products, pewter, tableware, and lead-wicked candles. So you're probably sitting there kind of wondering yourself, well, what's the big deal about lead? Why is that so dangerous? Well, lead is known to disrupt the movement and store calcium inside of cells, and this can increase cell stress, which can lead to the death of neurons and other brain cells. So as your brain slowly starts dying, they would be eating more and more lead, especially when they turned to others' bones to eat and tissues in general, as the tissues would have lead in it, which continued to basically expose them to higher and higher levels of lead. So it's like if the first person ate some lead, right? Let's say it was 50 parts per million, and then somebody ate them who also had 50 parts per million in their body, they would then take in that lead from their body, and then they got eaten. Well, then that person would be eating even higher levels of lead, and this continued to go on, which also could have led, again, to brain damage and issues within their body in general. Anyways, he came to suspect that the problems of lead poisoning, compounded by the effects of scurvy, could have been lethal for the Franklin crew. However, because of skeletal lead might reflect a lifetime exposure rather than just an exposure limited to the voyage, Bietti's theory could be tested only by forensic examination of preserved soft tissue as opposed to bone. Bietti decided to examine the graves of the buried crewmen on Beechey Island. After obtaining legal permission, Bietti's team visited Beechey Island in August of 1984 to perform autopsies on the 3 crewmen buried there. And do you know how, wild it is? Literally 140 years into the future almost, somebody performing an autopsy on you. I mean, you just really never know what can happen in life, but it's just so crazy to me to think about. Anyways, they started with the first crew member to die, leading stoker John Torrington. After completing Torrington's autopsy and exhuming and briefly examining the body of John Hartnell, the team, pressed for time and threatened by weather, returned to Edmonton with tissue and bone samples. Trace element analysis of Torrington's bones and hair indicated that the crewmen would have suffered severe mental and physical problems caused by lead poisoning. Although the autopsy indicated that pneumonia had been the ultimate cause of the crewmen's death, lead poisoning was cited as a contributing factor. During the expedition, the team visited a place about 1 kilometer north of the grave site to examine fragments of hundreds of food tins discarded by Franklin's men. Bietti noted that the seams were poorly soldered with lead, which had likely come in direct contact with the food. The release of these findings from the 1984 expedition and the photo of Torrington, a 138-year-old corpse, well preserved by permafrost in the tundra, led to wide media coverage and renewed interest in the Franklin expedition. Subsequent research has suggested that another potential source for the lead may have been in the ship's distilled water systems rather than the tinned food. KTH Ferrer argued that it is impossible to see how one could ingest from the canned food the amount of lead, 3.3 milligrams per day over 8 months, required to raise the lead level to 80 grams per deciliter, at which symptoms of lead poisoning began to appear in adults, and the suggestion that bone lead in adults could be swamped by lead ingested from food over a period of a few months or even 3 years seems scarcely tenable. In addition, tinned food was in widespread use within the Royal Navy at the time, and its use did not lead to any significant increase in lead poisoning elsewhere. However, uniquely for this expedition only, the ships were fitted with converted railway locomotive engines for auxiliary propulsion, which required an estimated 1 ton of fresh water per hour when steaming. It is highly probable that it was for this reason that the ships were fitted with a unique desalination system, which, given the materials in use at the time, would have produced large quantities of water with a very high lead content. William Battersby had argued that this is a much more likely source for the high levels of lead observed in the remains of the expedition members than the tinned food. A further survey of the graves was undertaken in 1986. A camera crew filmed the procedure shown in Nova's television documentary Buried in Ice in 1988. Under difficult field conditions, Derek Notman, a radiologist and medical doctor from the University of Minnesota, a radiology technician, Larry Anderson, also took many x-rays of the crewmen prior to autopsy. Barbara Schwager, an Arctic clothing specialist, and Roger Amy, a pathologist, assisted in the investigation. Bietti and his team had noticed that someone else had attempted to exhume Hartnell. In the effort, a pickaxe had damaged the wooden lid in his coffin, and the coffin plaque was missing. Research in Edmonton later showed that Sir Edward Belcher, commander of one of the Franklin rescue expeditions, had ordered the exhumation of Hartnell in October of 1852, but was thwarted by permafrost. A month later, Edward Ingfield, commander of another rescue expedition, succeeded with the exhumation and removed the coffin's plaque. Unlike Hartnell's grave, the grave of Private William Brain was largely intact. When he was exhumed, the survey team saw signs that his burial had been hasty. His arms and body and head had not been positioned carefully in the coffin, and one of his undershirts had been put on backwards. The coffin seemed too small for him, and its lid had pressed down on his nose. A large copper plaque with his name and other personal data punched into it adorned his coffin lid. In 1992, Franklin scholar Barry Ranford and his colleague Mike Yaroskevich discovered human skeletal remains and artifacts of what was suspected to be some of the lost crewmen of the expedition. The site matches the physical description of McClintock's boat place in 1993. Then, a team of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists returned to the site right around then, which they reference as NGLJ2, on the western shores of King William Island in Erebus Bay to excavate these remains. These excavations uncovered nearly 400 bones and bone fragments and physical artifacts ranging from pieces of clay pipes to buttons to brass fittings. Examinations of these bones by Annie Keenlyside, the expedition's forensic scientist, showed elevated levels of lead and many cut marks consistent with defleshing. On the basis of this expedition, it has been largely generally accepted that at least some of the groups of Franklin's men resorted to cannibalism in their final distress. A study published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology in 2015 concluded that in addition to these defleshing of bones, 35 bones had signs of breakage and pot polishing, which occurs when the ends of the bones, heated in boiling water, rub against the cooking pot they are placed in, which typically occurs in the end stage of cannibalism when starving people extract the marrow to eke out the last bit of calories and nutrition that they can. In 1992, Franklin author David C. Woodman, with the help of magnetometer expert Brad Nelson, organized Project Ujuluk, a search and wreck reported by the Inuit testimony to lie off in the waters of Adelaide Peninsula. Enlisting both the National Research Council and Canadian Forces patrol aircraft, each fitted with a sensitive magnetometer, a large search of the area to the west of Grant Point was surveyed from an elevation of 200 feet. Over 60 strong magnetic targets were identified, of which 5 were deemed to have characteristics most congruent with those expected from Franklin's ships. In 1993, Joe McInnes and Woodman organized an attempt to identify the priority targets from the year before. A chartered aircraft landed on the ice at 3 locations. A hole was drilled through the ice, and a small sector scan sonar was used to image the sea bottom. However, due to the icy conditions and uncertain navigations, it was not possible to exactly confirm the locations of the holes, and nothing was found, although hitherto unknown depths were found at locations that were consistent with Inuit testimony of the wreck. Then, in 1994, Woodsman organized and led a land search of the area from Collinson Inlet to modern Victory Point in search of the buried vaults spoken of in the testimony of the contemporary Inuit hunter Sapunger. A 10-person team spent 10 days in the search, sponsored by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and filmed by the CBC Focus North. No trace of the vaults were ever found. In 1995, an expedition was jointly organized by Woodman, George Hobson, and the American adventurer Stephen Trafton, with each party planning a separate search. Trafton's group traveled to the Clarence Islands to investigate Inuit stories of a white man's cairn there, but found nothing. Hobson's party, accompanied by archaeologist Margaret Bertelli, investigated the summer camp found a few miles to the south of Cape Felix, where some minor Franklin relics were found. Woodman, with 2 companions, traveled south from Wall Bay to Victory Point and investigated all likely campsites along the coast, finding only some rusted cans and a previously unknown campsite near Cape Marsa Luisa. In 1997, a Franklin 150 expedition was mounted by the Canadian film company Econova to use sonar to investigate more of the priority magnetic targets found in 1992. A senior archaeologist was Robert Greiner, assisted by Margaret Bertelli, and Woodman again acted as expedition historian and search coordinator. Operations were conducted from the Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker Lorimer. Approximately 40 square kilometers, which is 15 square miles, were surveyed without result near Kirkwall Island. When detached parties found Franklin's relics, primarily copper sheeting and small items, on the beaches north of O'Reilly Island, the search was diverted to that area, but poor weather prevented significant survey work before the expedition ended. A documentary, Oceans of Mystery: Search for the Lost Fleet, was produced by Econova about this expedition. 3 expeditions were mounted by Woodman to continue the magnetometer mapping of the proposed wreck sites. A privately sponsored expedition in 2001 and the Irish-Canadian Franklin search expeditions of 2002 and 2004. These made use of sled-drawn magnetometers working on sea ice and completed the unfinished survey of the northern Kirkwall Island search area in 2001 and the entire O'Reilly Island area in 2002 and 2004. All the high-priority magnetic targets were identified by solar using the ice as geological in origin. In 2002 and 2004, small Franklin artifacts and characteristic explorer tent sites were found on a small islet northeast of O'Reilly Island during shore searches. Then, in August of 2008, a new search was announced to be led by Robert Greiner, a senior archaeologist with Parks Canada. This search hoped to take advantage of the improved ice conditions using side-scan sonar from a boat in open water. Griner also hoped to draw from newly published Inuit testimony collected by the oral historian Dorothy Harley Eber. Some of Eber's informants had placed the location of one of Franklin's ships in the vicinity of the Royal Geographical Society Island, an area not searched by previous expeditions. The search was also including Inuit historian Louis Kamakok, also has found other significant remains of the expedition and would present this to the indigenous culture. HMS Investigator became icebound in 1853 while searching for Franklin's expedition and was subsequently also abandoned during their time frame. It was found in shallow water in Mercy Bay on July 25, 2010, along the northern coast of Banks Island in Canada's Western Arctic. The Parks Canada team reported that it was in good shape, upright, in about 11 meters or 36 feet of water. A new search was announced by Parks Canada in August of 2013. I know, we're running through all of it. On September 1st, 2014, a larger search by the Canadian team under the banner of the Victoria Strait Expedition found 2 items on Hat Island in the Queen Mount Gulf near Nunavut's King William's Island. A wooden object, possibly a plug for a deck hawse, an iron pipe of which the ship's chain cable would descend into the chain locker below, and part of the boat launching davit bearing the stamps of the 2 Royal Navy broad arrows. On September 9th of 2014, the expedition announced that on September 7th, it had located one of Franklin's 2 ships. The ship is preserved in good condition, with wide-scan sonar picking up even the deck planking. The wreck lies about 11 meters or 36 feet of water at the bottom of Wilmot and Crampton Bay in the eastern portion of Queen Mount Gulf, west of O'Reilly Island. On October 1st, at the House of Commons, Prime Minister Stephen Harper confirmed that the ship is indeed the HMS Erebus. This officially solved the issue as to where they went, or at least where the ship went. In September of 2018, Parks Canada announced that the Erebus had deteriorated significantly. An upwards buoyant force acting on the decking combined with storm swell in a relatively shallow water caused the displacement. According to the spokesperson, the underwater exploration in 2018 totaled only a day and a half due to the weather and ice conditions that was to continue into 2019. Also in September of 2018, a report provided specifics as to the ownership of the ships and contents. The UK will own the first 65 artifacts brought up from the HMS Erebus, while the wreck of both ships and other artifacts will be owned by Canada and the Inuit. On the 12th of September 2016, it was announced that the Arctic Research Foundation expedition had found the wreck of the HMS Terror south of King William Island in Terror Bay at a depth of 24 meters or 79 feet in pristine condition. In 2018, the team examined the wreck of the HMS Terror using a remotely operated underwater vehicle, or ROV, and collected photos and video clips of the ship and a number of artifacts. The group concluded that the Terror had not been left at anchor since the anchor cables were seen to be secured along the bulwarks. The FEFAP field surveys, excavations, and exhumations spanned more than 10 years. The result of this studying from King William Island and Beechey Island artifacts and human remains showed that Beechey Island crew had most probably died of pneumonia and perhaps tuberculosis, which was suggested by the evidence of pot disease discovered in brain. Toxicological reporting pointed to lead poisoning as a likely contributing factor. The blade-cut marks found on the bones from some of the crew were seen as signs of cannibalism. Evidence suggested that a combination of cold, starvation, and disease, including scurvy, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, all made worse by lead poisoning, killed everyone in the Franklin party. More recent chemical re-examination of the bone and nail samples taken from Hartnell and other crew members has cast doubts, though, on the role of lead poisoning. In 2013, a study determined that the levels of lead present in the crew members' bones had been consistent during their lives, and that there was no isotopic difference between lead concentrated within older and younger bone material. And had the crew been poisoned by lead from the solder used to seal the canned food or from the ship's water supplies, both the concentration of lead and its isotopic composition would have been expected to have spiked during the last few months. This interpretation was supported by a 2016 study that suggested the crew's ill health may in fact have been due to malnutrition and specifically zinc deficiency, probably due to the lack of meat in their diet. This study used micro X-ray fluorescent to map the levels of lead, copper, and zinc in Hartnell's thumbnail over the final months of his life, and found that, apart from during the last few weeks, lead concentrations within Hartnell's body were well within healthy limits. In contrast, zinc levels were far lower than normal and indicated that Hartnell would have been suffering from chronic zinc deficiency sufficient to have severely suppressed his immune system and left him highly vulnerable to worsening of the tuberculosis in which he was already infected. In the last few weeks of his life, his illness would have caused his body to start breaking down fat and muscle tissues, releasing lead previously stored in his bloodstream, and given rise to the high level of lead noted in previous analysis of soft tissue and hair. Franklin's chosen passage down the west side of King William's Island took Erebus and Terror into a plowing train of ice that does not always clear during the short summers. Whereas this kind of sucks, but the route along the island's east coast regularly clears in the summer and was later used by Roald Amundsen in his successful navigation of the Northwest Passage. The Franklin expedition, locked in ice for 2 winters in the Victoria Strait, was naval in nature and therefore not well equipped or trained for land travel. Some of the crew members heading south from Erebus and Terror hauled many items not needed for Arctic survival. McClintock noted a large quantity of heavy goods in the lifeboat at the boat place and thought them a mere accumulation of dead weight, of little use, and very likely to break down the strength of the sledge crews. Then, in 2017, Douglas Stinton, an adjunct professor of anthropology at the University of Waterloo and a former director of Nunavut's Department of Heritage and Culture, suggested that 4 sets of European human remains found on King William Island could possibly be women. He initially suspected that DNA testing would not offer up anything more, but to his surprise, they registered that there was no Y chromosomal element in their DNA. Stinton acknowledged that women were known to have served in the Royal Navy in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, but also pointed out that it could be that the DNA had simply degraded as further tests proved ambiguous, and he concluded the initial findings were almost certainly incorrect. In 1993, 3 bodies were found at the site of NGLJ-3 near Erebus Bay. The remains had originally been found by McClintock's expedition in 1859 and were rediscovered and buried by Schwatka 2 decades later. In 2013, a team led by Stinton had the remains exhumed for DNA testing and forensic facial reconstruction. The team's report, published in the Polar Journal of 2015, indicated that the reconstructions of the 2 intact skulls from the remains resemble Lieutenant Gore and Ice Master Reed of the Erebus. However, it was determined that the remains could not have belonged to Gore, as the Victory Point note stated that Gore had died before the abandonment of the ships in April of 1848. In May of 2021, one of the bodies was positively identified as Warrant Officer John Gregory, an Erebus engineer. A genealogy team tracked down Gregory's great-great-great-grandson, Jonathan Gregory, residing in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, and confirmed the familial match through DNA testing. The most meaningful outcome of the Franklin expedition was the mapping of several thousand miles and hitherto unsurveyed coastline by expeditions searching for Franklin's lost ships and crew. As Richard Sirix noted, the loss of the expedition probably added much more geographical knowledge than the successful return would have ever done. At the same time, it largely quelled the Admiralty's appetite for Arctic exploration. There was a gap for many years before the Nares expedition and Sir George Nares' declaration that was no thoroughfare to the North Pole. His words marked the end of the Royal Navy's historical involvement in Arctic exploration and the end of an era in which such exploits were widely seen by the British public as worthy expenditures of human effort and monetary resources. Given how difficult and risky it was for professional explorers to actually cross the Northwest Passage, it would be impossible for the average merchant ship of the day to use this route for trade. As a writer of the Athentheum put it, we think that we can fairly make out the account between the cost and the results of these Arctic explorations and ask whether it was worthwhile to risk so much for that which is so difficult to attain, and when attained, it's so worthless. The navigation of the Northwest Passage in 1903 and 05 by Roald Amundsen with the Yaw expedition ended the centuries-long quest for the route. Franklin's expedition explored the vicinity of what was ultimately one of the many Northwest Passages to be discovered. While the more famous search expeditions were underway in 1850, Robert McClure set out on a little-known McClure Arctic expedition on the HMS Investigator to also investigate the fate of Franklin's voyage. While he did not find evidence of Franklin's fate, he did finally ascertain an icebound route that connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and this was the Prince of Wales Strait, which was far to the north of Franklin's ships. On October 21, 1850, the following entry was recorded in the investigator's log. October 31st, the captain returned at 8:30 a.m. and at 11:30 a.m. The remainder of the parting, having upon the 26th instant ascertained that the waters we are now in communicate to those of the Barrow Strait, the northeastern limit being latitude 73 degrees, 31 north, longitude 114 degrees, 39 degrees. thus establishing the existence of the Northwest Passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. McClure was knighted for his discovery. While the McClure expedition obviously fared much better than Franklin's voyage, it was similarly beset by immense challenges, including the loss of the investigator and 4 winters on the ice, and a number of controversies, including the allegations of selfishness and poor planning on McClure's part. His decision to place numerous messages cairns, like along his route, ultimately saved his expedition, who were ultimately found and rescued by the crew of the HMS Resolute. In 1855, a British parliamentary committee concluded that Robert McClure deserved to be rewarded as the discoverer of the Northwest Passage. Today, the question of who discovered the Northwest Passage is a subject of controversy, because everything is, as all the different passages have varying degrees of navigability, although he did confirm the first geographical Northwest Passage that is navigable by ship under ideal conditions. McClure is rarely credited in modern times due to his troubled expedition, his poor personal reputation, and the fact that his expedition was after Franklin's, who has claimed to be the first discoverer, and the fact that he never actually traversed the strait that he found, instead choosing to portage over Banks Island. Members of the Franklin expedition crossed the southern shore of King William's Island and made it onto the Canadian mainland, and this is evident by the fact that human remains from the expedition have been found in the inland on the Adelaide Peninsula. This may have involved walking across the Simpson Strait, which is known as a way through from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It is possible that the Franklin expedition did discover that this is a passage, and none of the members of the party made it out alive, so it's not really known whether any member of the party had realized this. George Back had discovered the strait in 1834, but did not realize it was the Northwest Passage. In any case, by 1854, it was widely believed that the remnants of the party had crossed the strait, and Lady Franklin was informed of such on the 12th of January by the Admiralty. Franklin's claim to having discovered the passage is strengthened, though, by Charles Richard Weld's assertion that Franklin had long suspected the Simpson Strait did connect the two oceans. In 1860, Francis McClintock ascertained that the Simpson Strait was indeed a Northwest Passage. Following this discovery, to honor John Franklin's legacy, the Royal Geographical Society declared that his lost expedition was the first expedition to discover the passage. Lady Franklin was given a medal in his name. The Northwest Passage would not fully be navigated by boat until 1906, when Roald Amundsen famously traversed the passage on the yaw via the Simpson Strait. Despite the tragic loss of the crew of Franklin's expedition, them going missing is likely what led to most of the discoveries in the area and ultimately the finding of the real Northwest Passage, although Franklin is still credited with it. But that's the issue with the route to begin with. It is absolutely treacherous, and even for experienced captains, like multiple experienced captains with powerful ships, at least powerful ships at the time, nature is the ultimate decider as to what happens. But anyhow, what thank you guys for watching this long episode. I got kind of tired there towards the end, but if you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I really, honestly do appreciate all the support this channel's been getting. It's absolutely amazing. I do have my main channel, and I don't know, I felt, like I said, I kind of boxed in a little bit there, so it's really nice just to be able to, like, talk about weird stuff and how horrible things happen, and it's like a mixture of I get to creatively write, and I get to read articles, and I get to, like, combine the information and then tell you guys about it, so it's been a blast. Thank you for watching. There's been a ton of salt on the channel lately, for God knows what reason. I don't know. If you enjoy the content, just watch it. If you don't, watch it anyways. Just go ahead. Go ahead, write some angry comments too, because I just boost engagement. But, so again, all I can say is thank you for watching and engaging with it. But alright, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.